right, how we doing, everybody? That's awful. Can we try that again, please? So, look, you are the few, the proud, the believers in knowledge management that are at the last session of the day. You've made it here. Can we get a how we doing? All right. So this is a new one for KMWorld. I think I pestered Jane enough that she finally just said, fine, let's do it. For those of you that are not aware, I'm the host of KnowledgeCast, which is the world's largest KM podcast. And we are now live streaming that podcast to close out KMWorld this year. So this is going to be highly interactive. What we intend to do is basically three things. One, have our esteemed panelists and guests here talking about key takeaways from the show. What did they learn? What did they think were some of the most interesting new topics? Maybe what was there too much of, and maybe what was there not enough of, so that we can carry this into next year. Two, and this is why you have question cards in front of you, I want this session to be a little bit of a gap filler. Ask the question that you wish would have been answered over the last couple days and hasn't been. I've heard feedback from a few folks that they were looking for more tacit knowledge transfer and people stories. Ask these folks for those stories, because boy, do they have them. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about trends. Where is the industry going? This year has been a lot about knowledge graphs, and we're talking about AI. What are we going to be talking about at KMWorld in 5 years? So with all of that, let me introduce our guests. First of all, we've got Gloria Burke. She's the Global Director of Knowledge Management at a little consulting company called Slalom. Next up, we have Claude Monney, who's a digital workplace and KM advisor extraordinaire. Next, we've got Phaedra Boinodiris. Is that all right? Good? Who's a principal consultant at IBM. And then that disembodied head on the screen there is Larry Prusak. Larry's the author of The Smart Mission, NASA's Lessons for Making Knowledge, People, and Projects. So your job is to really get these folks talking. I'm going to be the facilitator here. I'm going to lead us off with a couple softball questions to lure them into a false sense of comfort before you try to start stumping them. And with that, Gloria, why don't you lead us off with a little bit of a story of how you got into KM? And this is a question I'd like all of you to answer. Now, the previous keynoter took too much time, so we have to talk a little quickly here, and we need to give short answers. So give me the short story. How did you get into KM?
I started with Booz Allen Hamilton, where they did not have a centralized knowledge program in the energy space. So I took the time to, as chief of staff to the head of the energy practice, to stop answering phone calls every day about what's on his hard drive and put it in a place where they could find it. And then a partner went to Unisys and brought me on as CKO and consolidated disparate systems all over the world for Unisys to create that centralized capability. And then got recruited by Adrian Yusta from Deloitte to go do it for Deloitte. And then Charles Schwab, and then finally here at Slalom, where Slalom is growing from 14,000 exponentially over the next 2 years and doing the same centralized thing. So 28 years of building knowledge centers of excellence for professional service companies.
I think that was a recruiting plug, by the way. Jean-Claude, how about you? How did you get in the field?
At the time, I was working for a semiconductor company in Europe. So ST Microelectronics was the 5th largest semiconductor company in the world, and our CEO went on a retreat, and he came back and took all of us group vice president. I was group vice president of IT at the time. And he said, what do you guys know about knowledge management? And there was a dead silence in a room. And so he said, well, actually a little bit like Drucker, if we want to predict the future of the company, we have to invent it. So we went back and we studied what was knowledge management. We actually wrote a book, which I still have internally, and we started to had my team to put in place the intranet, the digital workplace at the time, and the first community of practice with Lotus Note, etc. So it was a great learning. And just to give you one use case, so in semiconductor, you have a ton of software engineers that write code for function. You know, it could be an emitter, an amplifier, it could be all kind of things. And we thought we had a great idea. We wanted to have them reuse the code. And we made a tremendous mistake, is that engineers don't like to copy, they like to create. And it was a very hard sell to the reuse, and that's the first time I learned a lesson about reuse.
So if we're paying attention here, this is the other thing that we want to hear from our panelists. What mistakes have they made in order to get where they are now? So Jean-Claude, thanks for leading off with that one. Phaedra, your origin story, if you would, please.
Oh, let's see. My background comes from the video gaming industry, games for entertainment in particular. I had been a serial entrepreneur in the gaming space for about 14 years. And I had been a witness to a lot of shifts in the games industry, and decided to go back to my alma mater in order to pursue a master's, MBA, so that I could learn more about going after VC funding to start my own studio. And while I was there, I joined a competition, these things called case competitions, when a business will go to a business school with real life challenges. And students have overnight to form teams, then pitch ideas the next day. So I was on my 6th competition, and the contest was between UNC and Duke, big basketball rivals. I was, go Heels, right? The challenge was that this company, IBM, had business process management software, and they were looking for innovative ways of explaining it to non-technical people. And I had no clue what business process management was, but they handed each team a stack of papers about yay thick. And as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, this is a strategy game. Tweak business rules, and I see multiplayer gameplay, competing models. So I pitched this idea to my teammates. And there was this one guy on my team, we end up arguing till 3 in the morning, and we have to pitch at 8. And he says, games are for kids, and IBM is too conservative of a company, they're never gonna buy off on this idea. And I argue, I say, games are incredibly adept at explaining complex systems. The average age of the gamer today is 34 years old. So he picks up his stuff and he abandons the team. And the rest of us end up pitching the next day. And the vice president of strategy for IBM was one of the judges. And she pulled me aside right after the pitch and says, I want to fund this right now. Can you make it for me in 6 months? And I said, take years to make a really good video game. And she says, I just want a proof of concept. So the big idea, I ended up joining IBM to be our first global lead for serious games, which was my big foray and introduction into the world of knowledge management, to take sophisticated gaming engines and integrate real data and processes to solve problems.
Very cool. And Larry, if you would, please.
This is an art. First of all, I'd love to see people here. I'm sorry that I can't see any of you. The screen is just blank.
Everybody's waving and smiling at you, Larry. It's perfect. It's a beautiful sea of smiling faces.
You asked an interesting question, because I think Tom Davenport and I helped invent knowledge management in the early 1990s. A few other people were on the team with us, you might say. About 10 of us, Steve Denning and Tom Stewart, Nancy Dixon, others. We began to nose around the subject of knowledge. We thought that the slogan, getting the right information to the right person at the right time is all you need to do, couldn't be true. And there's something much more in organizations that allow them to be successful, and that's what they know. So we began to play around with knowledge and what is and how it works. And Davenport and I went to interview Peter Drucker. We were at Ernst & Young at the time. And he suggested that we start really doing research into how organizations manage and use knowledge better. He was older, but very, very sweet guy. And we put together a research program on, we had to call it knowledge management. It's not exactly an accurate term. You can manage around knowledge. It's very difficult to manage knowledge itself. But from that point on, I really got very involved in the subject. I had studied and taken a PhD in the history of ideas and was always very interested in these subjects. So Tom and I did all this research and wrote a book called Working Knowledge, which took off, much to our astonishment. I just had lunch with Tom yesterday. We were reviewing this. And the subject has had many, many incarnations. I mean, remarkably so. And it still is. I'm sorry I couldn't listen to all the talks. And I'm not too interested in technology, so it's not sort of for me. But I'd be happy to talk about what I think the future of working with knowledge is. The
Very
world
good.
is, okay, that's fine, I don't want to talk.
No, I'm going to come back to that, Larry, and that's actually one of the questions that I want to talk about a little bit later, but that's a wonderful introduction. Y'all, did you pick up on a little bit of a theme here? I often talk about knowledge management professionals as professional hole fillers. And what I mean by that is virtually everyone here had the same story. They didn't set out to have the title of KM. They saw a gap, they saw an issue, they saw a need, and they filled it. And it turned out that that evolved into them being KM professionals. Show of hands, how many people have a similar story where there was a need and they just started doing it before they knew they were doing KM? Yeah, so maybe about 2/3. That's about right. That's excellent. So next question for our panelists before we start pulling on a couple questions is, what was that aha session or topic that you were excited about? And Larry, unfortunately, we'll leave you out of this one since you didn't get to attend the conference. But for the three folks who were here, and Phaedra, we'll start with you this time, what was that like, oh wow, this is new thing that you heard this week?
First of all, I was absolutely overjoyed to see as many talks as I did on the subject of ontologies and knowledge graphs. I mean, really, that was super cool and novel from my perspective. I'll also point out, I love the serendipity of the water cooler conversations. In truth, just to give you an example, last night we went out to dinner, a bunch of the speakers, and we're sitting there chit-chatting, and I get this tap on my shoulder from the table behind me, and it's these two older women, and they said, where are you guys from? What are you a part of? Like, your dinner conversations are so fascinating. And I'm like, well, we're at Knowledge Management World, we're at the JW Marriott, and we're talking about the future of artificial intelligence and knowledge management. And I asked them, like, where are you two from? And they're like, well, we're psychologists at this big psychology and psychiatry summit that's happening down the road. So we start talking back and forth, and I don't know if you guys, if you listened in on the talk earlier from Beth Rudden, where she was introducing her conversational AI, and she's got these two bots. One bot has been trained to be, professional and polite and wonderful, and the other one is, cynical, trained with campfire horror stories for kids, right? And I asked one of the psychologists, I said, what question do you want to ask the bot? Like, ask it something that a patient has asked you recently. And there she was typing it in. Is this being recorded?
Oh yeah, and live.
I can't say it, but it was pretty funny. It was a very funny question. And the bots just both gave these delightful answers that just made us all laugh out loud. And then the conversation went to, why aren't we talking about AI in our psychology summit? And how AI can augment our work.
Nice.
And that was just lovely.
Such a cool moment. And I didn't think I had to say it, but yeah, please no profanity on the panel. So Jean-Claude, how about you next? What was the light bulb?
I guess it's two things that happen. I'm very focused on what's happening in a workplace with the client I work with, and that hybrid model, and the lack of or the destruction of the social capital in companies, because that human conversation is not happening as it used to happen. And you've heard me saying, a person who told me that she was just like 6 months on a new role, a new company, and she had never met a coworker. And I said, so what do you do about it? And she said, well, I'm intentional about it. Meaning that every week I reach out to someone, do a meet and greet, and really try to build that human relationships and so on. And on the other hand, of course, I'm just fascinated by technologies, probably since I was born, and the reality of AI being infused in all systems, and in particular with the combination of the graph, which can capture some of the dialogue of human and bring that to the level of either knowledge. We can now capture better knowledge. Experience, we talk a lot about expertise, but for me, experience is very, very relevant. You don't always need expert. In some cases, yeah, but most of the time, I would say 80% of the time, you need experience. People who's done it before you that can, help you get faster to it. So the fact that technology is becoming that reality today, because it's really getting there, I think was a great thing that I've seen in the few sessions I was able to attend.
Very good. Excellent. And Gloria?
Yeah, I had the pleasure of moderating Track B yesterday all day, and Phaedra gave an amazing presentation on AI that had to do with not just AI as a tool and a machine, but the human aspect of it. And it was an aha for me, because the combination of how you would program it, that the ethics around it, was really very compelling. Because I think most of us, when we talk about AI and ML, it's okay, how could we just serve some things up? But you have to think about it and be cognizant of how many different diverse people we have humanly, and apply that to the engine as well. I mean, it's not just about serving up information, but knowing the audience and knowing the appropriate things for people to have. So really the human element of how you talked about, and the ethics about making sure you're getting that right before you let that engine go wild.
Excellent. So that's the perfect segue to the next question I want to ask before we start getting some cards up. So I did a very non-scientific poll last night over cocktails. And what I heard from a bunch of the participants is that the one question that they didn't feel had been answered yet, or something that they were looking for more real-world examples around is this. There are too many challenges in getting people to share their knowledge. So technology's cool, we love our knowledge graphs, these have been wonderful topics at the conference, but what I heard people asking for was more stories around encouraging people to share their knowledge, removing the barriers that naturally exist in a lot of organizations. We talk about this from the standpoint that a lot of people don't share their knowledge because it's power, and they want to hold on to their job. As long as I know it and nobody else does, they're going to keep their job. Because there's fear. If they say the wrong thing, their boss is going to be mad at them. Or because it's just too hard, that the tools don't support it. And the four of you have all had incredibly successful careers in removing these types of barriers. And so what I would like to ask of each of you is to tell a real-world story of how you've succeeded in getting people who are perhaps reticent to actually share their knowledge. Larry, would you start us off with that one, please?
Well, I have a great story, but I once worked for a very large and prestigious consulting firm, and they had a very, very good system of identifying who knows what. People, what their expertise was, each individual. So people could find others who really knew things. And I was working with a woman who was sort of moderate level of management, and she got an RPI from a very big firm, request for proposal. And she said, gee, there's 9 people in this firm who really could answer this well, but I only have 48 hours. How am I going to get to them? How are they going to share this? And she was really flustered. But she went out and she sent notes to all of them. Please help me answer this, or would you like to work on this, et cetera, et cetera. And they all responded positively. Well, I was astounded because I had worked quite a while for Ernst & Young and IBM, where I must say people did not share knowledge that well. Some did, but most didn't. I said, how could that be in this firm? Why is it working here? And I found out what they had was they enforced the norm of sharing. In other words, if you didn't share what you knew under all circumstances, slowly but surely everyone got to know that about you. And when it came time to be reviewed, no matter how much you could sell, you'd be slowly told you may be happier at another organization. They enforced the norm of sharing. If you're really serious about sharing knowledge, one of the things you have to do is enforce the norm. Don't hire people who don't share knowledge. Don't promote people who don't share knowledge. And if people don't share knowledge and the word gets around, get rid of them. It's as simple as that.
So
Short answer.
that's a great answer, Larry, and it's also one that's pretty clearly an answer to leadership, right? That requires leadership 100% bought into knowledge sharing.
No question, that's true.
Very good. All right, Gloria, do you have one for us?
I do. I was working for a large professional services company and doing a very large-scale transformation, and there was a lot of hoarding going on all over the world in every member firm. And I think one of the ways in which we got around that was to define the end state vision and the outcomes that the company was trying to achieve with senior leadership. And then making that roadmap, here's how we're going to get there. And the biggest piece of it was really communications, culture change, and engagement. And we took a pronged approach. From an HR performance perspective, we put requirements in of being able to contribute content and be known for contributing that content, and measured that by who are the top contributors, and recognized that through a reward system. But we also instituted a utilization code for practitioners who were between engagements and sitting on a bench. Give them an opportunity to write white papers, collaborate with others, and be known and recognized for that. And utilization means what your bonus is at the end of the year. So that was a really big incentive for practitioners to lean in and support the knowledge initiative. And we also created this concept of being part of a community of knowledge sharers, being a knowledge champion in each part of the business, to be an evangelist of why knowledge sharing is more powerful than knowledge hoarding, and to really make that resonate with each persona. The other thing we did was we met with them, persona by persona, and answered the question, what's in it for me if I change my behavior? Because if you push something out at a very high level globally, and it came from me as the CKO, delete. But if it comes to you as this really matters to me because this is going to make me more efficient in building a proposal, or I'm going to ramp up a week more quickly in delivery because I have standardized methods, frameworks, models, and I don't have to repeat that or recreate that, that is compelling. But I didn't focus on technology because technology is just the enabler that sits underneath it. Once you get everything else in your mind defined and you have those requirements, then you go shopping for the technology to enhance the processes that you want to put in place.
Phenomenal. That's why we always name technology last in the people, process, content, culture, and technology piece. I want to pull on a string with you for a second, Gloria, because this actually answers another question that came up. You mentioned measures and rewards. And a lot of folks that I've heard from are saying, well, how do you measure the success of KM? So can you say a little bit more about what specifically you were measuring? What made a good KM measure?
Yeah, I measure everything. I want to know how much content we have, what's the age of the content, where is the content coming from, what part of the business, what part of the industry, what part of the globe. I want to be able to give a report to a portfolio leader or solution leader saying, here's the slice, a picture of your content, and here are your gaps. But that's really important. It's not, you may collect a lot of things, but if you don't have the best content in a certain area, then you have a gap. So metrics, really looking at the content, the age of the content, the validity of the content, and really have the leaders for each area take a look at all their proposals, all their frameworks, and badge them best in class. You don't want to boil the ocean. You want to give your people your best work. So we would measure what we have in each category of content, what type of proposals, what type of frameworks, and put it in front of SMEs and leaders to really put the stamp on that. And we also wanted to know who, as I mentioned before, who are the top contributors, because then we can showcase them as sharing in a way that matters most to the company and recognizing and rewarding that. So measure things across the board.
Excellent, perfect. Jean-Claude, how about your story about removing those knowledge blocks?
I think the most fascinating story for me was when I was at Microsoft and the leadership embedded, knowledge in the performance management system. It's very public, so I can say it, is that, of course, you pay for achieving your goal, but you also get rewarded for sharing and reusing knowledge. So how do we do that? Well, they have a system of basically a quarterly review with the manager, and you basically have to show that you have intentionally, shared the knowledge with the intent of being reused. Not just put something on the intranet that nobody knows that is there, but who do you know that could benefit of what you've learned during your project, etc. So I think that was very fascinating to see that. But having the management put this into a compensation process is one thing, is how do you experience the culture of the company? Well, my simple view of that over the years is you experience the culture of the company through your direct management, your first level manager. When the company says they're inclusive, then this is your manager is inclusive in the meeting, et cetera, et cetera. So what happened, what we tried to do, and my team, is to provide this line to the manager. If somebody comes and basically says, we got this project at Bank of America, and we got this $25 million deal, et cetera, et cetera. And the question should be, yeah, great, what did you learn and who did you share it to? Okay, so immediately re-emphasize the value that the company wanted to bring there. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, which I think, unfortunately, I see some company dropping, and I think they should not drop, is community of practice. So I think there's a tremendous value in community of practice. So again, to give you some numbers and a practical example, there were 100 communities of practice at Microsoft the time I was there until I left in 2017. And every month, the community facilitator would organize a 1-hour meeting where there would be 3 projects that will be presented by the project team. What was the problem with the customer? How did you approach it? What did you do? What did you learn, right? Simple stuff like that. But that would disseminate basically the knowledge to the company. But the other thing we'd do, it would build that report of, like when the German person was talking and there was an American audience or an Asia audience, it was fascinating to see the bonding of people and so on. So there was this flow of knowledge sharing from practice, and they were open to share also, mistake. I mean, NASA is very famous about having what did I fail kind of story every month, but I mean, community of practice, if you don't have one in your company, it's a good thing to have.
Excellent. Well, it's also, I think, even more critical today during the Great Resignation. Community practices are a great knowledge capture tool that feels very natural to experts. We actually had a question from the audience about this, so Jean-Claude, we'll stick with you for a second. The question is, I am looking to create communities of practice in my organization for the first time. How do I get started?
Well, I think you need to find out where there is already a group of people that have a common purpose and they're working together. I mean, it's always easier to do that. There, and to understand some of the basic rule of community of practice. Number one, you don't direct them. It's a bit of a self-managed kind of things. If anything, what we shared in the past is to use a community health index, because a community has a life cycle. For sure the Windows 7 community is dead, right? So what I mean by that is that you need to understand there's a life cycle, and you can measure the interaction of the community, you can, the knowledge capture, you can do a lot of things. But start with something that exists already, a group of people that are there, and then find. I'll be glad to share my recommendation on that, but there's a book also, I mean, so many books on this, and Stan Garfield is really the knowledge Wikipedia. If you go on his side, you will find a lot of recommendation there on how to start that.
Very good. And Phaedra, how about your knowledge blocker removal story?
I think the problem is less that people don't want to share knowledge because they're afraid of losing power. I think the reason why people don't want to share knowledge is because there is a less perceived value based on what that knowledge base is. Right? And actually, that was my big shtick in my talk yesterday, is because I was making the point of saying, earning trust in AI is not a technical problem with a technical solution. It's a socio-technical problem that requires a holistic approach that must be multidisciplinary. And so I've leaned in hard into pushing teams to be multidisciplinary and also shining the light on this perceived bias on whose knowledge has value. And even other AI summits, that I've been to curate content and market their whole summit to a certain category of people and not to others. Right? You pick up books on artificial intelligence. Who are they written for? Which audience? You take a class in data and AI ethics in a higher ed institution. It's communicated to and marketed for data scientists and machine learning scientists and computer scientists and not everybody else. And yet we desperately need social scientists, designers, psychologists, industrial organizational psychologists, lawyers, et cetera, working with data scientists in order to curate AI models responsibly. Yet their knowledge is devalued. That's the problem. And I look around and I think, how do we change the culture of organizations to really push this hard? In addition to leaning into humor and comics, I started making comics, which is totally fun, and art therapy. But also I've been looking at schools and our school systems, and again, having conversation with deans about what about having a data and AI ethics program? And their first response is, oh, good idea, should it be in the School of Humanities or the School of Engineering? And it's like, see? See? That's the problem. So that's what
Excellent.
me.
Great themes here.
If
Leadership.
I want just to
please,
add to
Jean-Claude.
that, because she really hit a chord on me, is that it's the diversity of sharing and the sharing of diversity. And that's one of the key success of community of practice is diversity. Don't put only one type of role. Put all the role there, right? All the role. Yeah. And that's how you can, and you're so right,
Yeah. And when we set up our Center of Excellence, the first thing we did, we said, we don't care what your background is. You have a background in design, you have a background in sales, but you care about AI ethics, you're in. Yeah. And by the way, we want you to work on projects with us together. Start there.
Very good. Larry, it looked like you wanted to jump in on this one. Did I misread that?
No, I think what Jean-Claude said is true. You really can't create a community of practice. You can find them, you can discover them. They're there.
Well
so
said.
He's right.
Excellent, good. So we have some wonderful questions coming in. I'm not sure we'll be able to get to all of them, but this is excellent. Thank you for those. The next question that we had that I wanted to hit on was about standing up a new KM program. So one of our guests is asking, when building a KM program, does that happen from the top down, from leadership, or from the bottom up, more of a grassroots approach? Would anybody like to field that? We don't need to go through everybody. Does anybody have a strong answer?
Yeah,
Gloria?
I'm in the process of that right now, and it really is starting with leadership, or what are the outcomes for the business that they're looking to achieve with their customers, and then to look internally and say, what are the things we are trying to solve for? What are the outcomes we're looking for, and what are we trying to solve for? And start there. Bottom up, forum groups. What are the pain points of your practitioners by their persona? What's keeping them from finding knowledge, accessing knowledge quickly? What are the pain points of the disconnects of not being able to find expertise to go hand in hand with that? So I think, to me, it's always been start with the strategy and then understand the pain points of the business, then build your requirements. And also you have to ask yourself, if you're in a situation where you already have a knowledge platform built, is it wise to keep putting Band-Aids on something that isn't really a fit for those requirements that you laid out? Or is it more efficient for the company and for all of your people to start with a white sheet of paper? Technology has evolved so much over the past 3 to 5 years, and if you're still working with a platform, you say, okay, I'm just going to upgrade to the next version, but it doesn't have this, so I'm going to go buy this third-party thing that I'm going to put on top of it. You look at it, all of a sudden, you've created this hybrid that's very hard for your IT department to support, number one. And if you start with the clean sheet of paper, your IT department's going to love you, and you're going to cut significant costs for the company along the way.
Don't be afraid to blow it up then.
Yeah, don't be afraid to pull out that sheet of paper and say, if I had my way, what is the right foundation? How would I build this? Is it going to meet those needs of the requirements and the outcomes? And then measure it against what you currently have. You could do a T-chart and you'll see, wow, this isn't going to do that, but this will.
Excellent. Here's a little bit of a curveball, and this is important to me because my Bitcoin is way down. How do you see blockchain tech being used in KM in the years to come? Does anybody have a sense of that? Jean-Claude?
Sure, why not? I don't play baseball, but there is a fundamental thing that is interesting in blockchain is trust. And one of the key elements of knowledge sharing and reuse is trust. So I talk about the pedigree of knowledge, right? So when you need knowledge and you access knowledge, whether it is a tacit knowledge or explicit knowledge, right? You have to look at the pedigree of knowledge. What element do you have in your possession to make the decision that you are going to reuse that knowledge, assuming what you get is relevant, which is the other part of the knowledge, right? So when you get an article or something, or you look at who's the author and these kind of things, right? So I think if there is a way to to provide a higher degree of trust by using a system that is by definition, pretty trustable, a ledger like that, I think it could be something to look into it.
Very good. Next question. Tim asks, can we hold KMWorld in Europe sometime? Sure, I'm going to go with yes. Stay tuned for KM Dublin in 2023. So next up, the vendors this year are mostly focused on search, which is interesting. I noticed that too, a lot of new ones popping up. What do you all think will be the future focus of KMWorld in 5 to 10 years? Any best guesses out there? Larry, you want to start us off?
I was supposed to say something different. I think the focus would be on wisdom. I think, the world is awash with knowledge. I don't want to quote all the statistics I could, but there's an enormous amount of knowledge being produced in the world, real knowledge. With China's entry into the global markets and its growth of universities, India too, the Middle East, there's a spectacular amount of knowledge being produced. Is the world any better for this? Where is that knowledge going? How is it being used? And I think the lack of wisdom is a bigger problem than the lack of knowledge. And I think maybe, although you can call it KMWorld, that's fine, but I think we should sort of begin to focus on knowledge about how to live, knowledge about how to build societies, knowledge about how to treat each other better in this world.
Excellent.
Wisdom world.
Wisdom world.
Yeah.
Patent pending, copyright.
I'd like to see it come back. I'd like to see
Well
the program.
done, Larry.
Gloria?
Yeah, I'd like to see the program come back to introduce some strategy about building a knowledge center of excellence or a knowledge program. Because I think we've gotten so focused on the technology piece of it when what really, in my mind, made all my projects successful was having a really well laid out strategy and a very strong culture change program that was underneath it. And we don't seem to have a balance of that in the program, and I'd like to see it go back to technology as an enabler, but all of these other things that you plan for are truly what's going to make it successful. Because the one thing I always think of in my mind is you've got to bring the people in and get them involved in building it. People support what they help to build, and then they have an ongoing stake in its success. You've got to get that piece right.
Excellent. Jean-Claude, future KM/Wisdom world, what's it going to look like?
Well, after what Larry said, what is it to say? I mean, he's right. I mean, when we look at the evolution of a knowledge worker, which Colin was rightly presenting in his talk earlier, I think there is a point where you see the democratization of technology bringing such a high level of knowledge. Look at our phone, how powerful our phones are, the way that they tag all our picture, and we don't have to tag anything. They find anything. Now you take a picture and you have a OCR of the character. You touch you take a picture on a slide and there is a URL. You click the URL, it goes. I mean, it's just like, that's not going to be the issue in 10 years. The issue is what Larry's saying is that we're lacking empathy, leadership. I think empathy is what worries me the most. If we look at the sadness of the world today, of the wars and everything, is because we lack basic empathy. So how are we going to for me, that's a far more important thing than solving the knowledge sharing and reuse.
Excellent. And Phaedra, you get the last word on this.
We'll be talking about which ontologies do we trust to power our own AI. So back to trust and wisdom. Yeah. And then whose ontology represents us best?
And what ethics behind?
Oh yeah, heck yeah. which one matches my point of view?
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, wonderful. I want to thank our panelists and thank everybody for being here. This is a session that I hope we get to do in years to come. To me, as I said, one of the greatest things about this is that it gives us a little bit of a do-over at the end of the conference to make sure that we got those last questions answered. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you all for being here, and I wish you very happy KM transformations and very wise collections of knowledge. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.